In this first video, we're going to look at the election of 1860, which is obviously one of the most important elections in American history. Everyone knew that the coming 1860 election would be absolutely crucial. The Democratic Convention was held in Charleston, South Carolina, and it pretty much demonstrated that the Democratic Party had officially split up. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was still the leading presidential candidate of the Democrats, supported by the Northern Democrats. The Northern Democrats probably had more power in the convention than their actual strength in the Democratic Party nationally, their actual numbers, which was much more Southern. Douglas ran on popular sovereignty, as he had explained in his Freeport Doctrine. Southern Democrats, of course, rejected this Freeport Doctrine, especially about the idea of the Union taking actions to make slavery less attractive through taxes. Douglas now tried to back away from this in the convention, from the position he'd taken in his Freeport Doctrine debate with Lincoln. Of course, the Southern Democrats pushed for a party plank saying the federal government couldn't prohibit slavery in the states or territories. Heck, the Dred Scott decision had said that, and that they thought it should be the policy of the Democratic Party. Here you can see a cartoon showing Stephen Douglas getting spanked, which of course reflects the view of the Southern-oriented Democrats. The convention got so heated, delegates decided to postpone further action to meet later in Baltimore, sort of giving them a 6-week period where they could cool off. When they met in Baltimore, unfortunately, tensions hadn't cooled off, with the Northern Democrats having weight that was outstripped their actual numbers in the party. They carried the nomination. They got Douglas as the Democratic candidate. They also adopted a platform that supported popular sovereignty, with an added provision that they could promise to obey the Supreme Court decisions. And obviously reference to Dred Scott, and thus a conflicting platform if you think about it. This didn't please the Southern Democrats, and they walked out. They organized their own convention of Democrats, and they nominated James Buchanan's vice president, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Southern Democratic platform explicitly endorsed slavery, putting into law the Dred Scott decision. The Republicans, who held their own convention in Chicago, had less of a fight. Here you can see a picture outside the convention hall in Chicago. The Republicans knew that the Democrats were fracturing, and that in 1856 they carried every northern state but Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. Heck, if they carried even one of these in 1860, they knew they should win. The only real challenger to Abraham Lincoln's nomination was William Seward. Seward, however, had already held a long career and made a lot of enemies. Lincoln, on the other hand, was fresh and had a lot of attributes. He was a former Whig, like most of the delegates. He spoke of slavery as a moral issue, evil, but he wasn't an abolitionist or radical, and he was from Illinois, which was key. After several ballots, Lincoln overtook Seward and won the nomination, while the party declared its opposition to slavery in all the territories. The platform, as I say, called for no slavery into the territories, although trying to soften opposition by reaffirming the right of the states to, quote, order their own affairs. It was not so subtle a reminder that the Republicans would not try to get rid of slavery where it already existed, which of course is what the abolitionists wanted. The election, perhaps predictably, did spawn other third, fourth parties. The most important of these extra parties was the Constitutional Union Party, which nominated John Bell of Tennessee. The platform of the Constitutional Union Party and John Bell, shown here, was simply sort of reinforcing the idea of keeping the Union together, but it just avoided slavery specifics. And not surprisingly, the party was most popular in the border states, where if there were a war, that's where the fighting would be. But because it avoided specifics, it obviously wasn't going to solve any problems. The 1860 general campaign was heated, not surprisingly. Shown here is a cartoon of the candidates ripping the country apart, trying to win their own peace. Democrats stoked fear of the Republicans in the South, and a wave of almost hysteria swept through much of the South. Democrats said that if Lincoln won, there'd be black equality and racial amalgamation. Campaign posters showed black men kissing white women while Lincoln looked on, smiling. Throughout the South, whites worried over slave insurrections as a result of the election, and they tightened their slave codes as a result. Making things seem worse in the South was a horrible drought, the worst in memory. The Republicans tried to diffuse attempts to make them appear radical, at least in the moderate northern states. They stressed rather honest Abe, which Lincoln embraced. I could add that the Republicans did not even run campaigns in 10 of the southern states. It wasn't even worth it to them. In the moderate northern states, Republicans worked to show that they were against racial equality and to prove that blacks were inferior, thus trying to win over some of the moderate northern Democrats there. Smartly, the Republicans also stressed economic issues, tailoring their proposals to specific areas. Keep in mind that the recession or the Panic of 1857 still lingered. For the ocean states, the Republicans promised federal aid to harbor projects. For the interior states, they promised federal aid for the railroads. For the West, they called for a Homestead Act, a bill to divide up the western lands into small chunks so that the average farmers could afford it. The South had been against this, realizing that small sections of land meant no slaves. In total, only 22 of 27 Republican platform provisions even mentioned slavery, but those two that kept slavery out of the territories were the key issues. Not surprisingly, given all this, the relationship between the Republicans and the abolitionists was ambivalence at best. While they realized that the Republicans were the best they could hope for, heck, the Republicans might even win, they were angry by the attempts of the Republicans to win over the moderates. The abolitionists, of course, still pushed to have slavery wiped out in the states where it already existed, and many of them thought that African Americans were in fact equal. In the end, Lincoln won 39.8% of the vote, 180 electoral votes. Douglas, the Northern Democrats candidate who still had the least, a smidgen of Southern support, if you can say that, was second with 29.5% and 12 electoral votes. Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic candidate, was third with 18.1% of the vote, but because he carried so many deep South states, he had 72 electoral votes only. Bell's Union Party got 12.6% and 39 of the Electoral College votes. Lincoln carried 54% of the popular vote in the North, but predictably didn't get one electoral vote in the South. He scarcely got any popular votes in the South outside of a few urban counties in the border states. Here you see a newspaper article announcing Abraham Lincoln's election. This concludes the first video on the election of 1860.